welcome back. In this section, we are going to start learning about the nervous system. So when we talk about the nervous system, we divide it into two main categories. The first is the central nervous system, and by central nervous system, we only mean two structures, the brain and the spinal cord. If it's outside the brain but attached to the brain, it's not central nervous system. If it's attached to the outside of the spinal cord, it's not central nervous system. So only the brain itself and the spinal cord itself. Those nervous tissues compose the central nervous tissue. Any other type of nervous tissue belongs to part of the peripheral nervous system. So all of those sensory receptors, a bunch which we haven't learned and some which we did learn when we studied the integumentary system, all of those are part of the peripheral nervous system. They will all have nerves that bring messages towards the central nervous system. So anything that has the word nerve in it, by definition, is part of the peripheral nervous system. We will learn what a nerve is, but not just yet. So let's start first with the peripheral nervous system. This is just an introductory so that we can move on from here and understand muscles and all that before we dive deeply into the nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, we have a sensory component and a motor component. And so the sensory component is taking information from receptors all throughout the body and sending it towards the central nervous system. Whereas the motor division is taking information from the central nervous system about what effect we want to have happen and sends that towards the body. So looking at the nervous system, on the top left is a random slide taken from someplace in the central nervous system. And if we blow it up closer on the bottom right, it looks like a picture we've already seen earlier this semester, where we have that huge neuron and all those other background black dots are actually all individual cells known as neuroglial cells or neuroglia. And these are all the supporting cells that we will learn about in a later topic. So let's just spend a couple of moments reviewing what we know about neurons and diving in even deeper. So a neuron is amitotic. So A is a prefix that means not. So what this means is that a neuron does not undergo mitosis. So once it is formed, it's the way it's going to be until it dies. So if you're counting on making new neurons all your life, that's not going to happen. So please be kind to your neurons, because when you're 90 years old, you may wish you had 1,000,000 that you blew off earlier. So that brings us to our second point. Because they're amitotic, they have to have longevity, and for all of us, hopefully more than 100 years. And what is very interesting about neurons is they have a super high metabolism. They need a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose because they are continuously working. And in fact, if they go 2 minutes without an adequate supply of either, they will start dying off. So your neurons die off faster with a lack of blood supply than, say, for instance, your heart muscles do with a lack of blood supply. So looking at the structure of a typical individual neuron, there is the main component which holds most of the organelles, not all of them, but most of them. And this part is called the soma, the neurosoma, or we can just call it the cell body. And this is where the nucleus with its prominent nucleolus is going to be located. Now extending from, so where are cell bodies located in the nervous system? Well, in the central nervous system, they're located in structures known as gray matter, okay? So there's all different kinds of gray matter. A lot of it is on the surface of the brain, but we also have some gray matter deeper in the brain. Whereas in spinal cord, the gray matter is in the center of the spinal cord. And then outside of the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, it's going to be located in a structure known as a ganglion. So extending from the surface of the cell body are structures, multiple structures, 100, 1,000 of them, each of which is called a dendrite. And they look like all these branches coming off of the central tree area because they taper down. In fact, they are bringing messages towards that central cell body. So they receive a lot of the signals coming into the neuron, and they send all the messages towards the cell body. So each dendrite can be sending a totally different message, and the cell body has to make sense of all these incoming messages. And then there is one structure which carries outgoing messages, and that structure is known as the axon. So that nerve impulse that's going to carry the outgoing message is going to generate in this triangular area between the cell body and the axon, known as the axon hillock. So from the axon hillock, the message gets carried down the axon, and then near the end of the axon, it will branch into what are known as axon terminals. And then at the end of the axon terminal, there are these little bulbous swellings. So if you've ever seen like those pictures of the frogs with the big bulbous tips on all of their toes, that's what it looks like. And those bulbous swellings are called terminal boutons or synaptic knobs. Terminal bouton is just a French word that means terminal buttons. Okay? So that nerve impulse is going from the axon hillock to the axon terminal to the terminal bouton. And all along the axon, we will have had organelles that were made in the cell body travel down all the way to the terminal bouton. And so they can be stored inside some of these organelles. Some of them are vesicles, and they are going to carry chemicals which are going to be important for sending the message to the next cell. And this process is going to be known as neurotransmission, and we will be talking a lot about that later on. So looking closer at the end, the distal end of the axon, when it gets near the end, it branches into axon terminals, and at the end of each axon terminal, we have a little terminal bouton. So incoming messages can come in from the dendrites. They also can come in from the cell body or from the axons itself, but they only go out the axon. Now, most nerve axons in mammals have what we call a myelin sheath, which is what is shown on this particular diagram. And so this myelin sheath is going to be made up of either these cells or parts of cells which coat the myelin, which coat the axon. And there are gaps either between the cells or between the cell parts. And it's in these little gaps that we can have an axon branch if it wants to branch. And much later, when you study neurophysiology, you will learn what happens in some of these branching axons. But for now, it's not important. So, but let's talk for a few minutes about myelin and what it is. It is mostly lipid, and then it's about 20% protein. And so it's this fatty, slightly proteinaceous covering slathered all over the axons. So think of something like Crisco, or if you don't know what Crisco is, think of like lard at room temperature, and you throw a little bit of protein powder in there. This starts forming in utero, but the vast majority of this myelin sheath forms after birth in the first 2 years of life. So it's super important to have the correct nutrition the first 2 years of life so that you can make this myelin sheath. It's not a time to be putting a baby on a fat-restricted diet. And in fact, the American Academy of Pediatricians says no skim or low-fat milk during this time period at all, because we need this myelin sheath, and you will understand why we need this myelin sheath when we dive into the nervous system in depth later on. So why do we have this myelin sheath? Well, it does a couple of important things. Yes, it protects it and electrically isolates it. So what does that mean? So for a minute, compare it to like if you were doing repairs at home and you were taking a ceiling fan or a light switch out, and you would see all the little wires coming at you, and you would see some were coated with red rubber and some with black rubber and some with green or yellow. And that's so they don't touch each other and create a cross current. So that's one thing that the myelin sheath is doing. It's protecting that axon and keeping the message so two different axons aren't cross-talking. But much more importantly, the myelin sheath is going to change the speed of that nerve impulses travel along that. So you'll learn more about that later on as well. All right. So now let's back up and look at the neurons themselves, and let's look at them two different ways. Let's look at them, what are the general categories of their jobs and what do they look like? So the general categories of their jobs is called the functional classification. So every neuron in your body can be classified functionally and structurally. They're not mutually exclusive. You give every neuron both. So functional classification, if they are carrying information towards the central nervous system, that means they're carrying sensory information. So we would call it a sensory neuron. And another way of saying that is afferent neuron. If they're carrying information away from the central nervous system, that means they're carrying some type of message which is either going to cause a muscle reaction, either contracting or relaxing, or it's going to cause a gland to secrete, all of which are activities. So we call this a motor neuron. Okay? And this motor neuron is exiting the central nervous system and it's causing some kind of effect. So the synonym for motor neuron is efferent neuron. So we have afferent going towards and efferent going away. So now we have neurons, and you can go directly from a sensory to a motor, but most of the time you're going to have neurons between the two, which means the sensory has taken it into the central nervous system over here. The motor is taking it out of the central nervous system. So it means all the in-between neurons have to be in the central nervous system. And these are called interneurons. Inter, the prefix meaning between. Okay, so three functional classes: sensory, also known as afferent, then the optional interneuron, which is in the central nervous system, and then a motor or efferent neuron. So towards the CNS, in the CNS, which is the option, and out of the CNS. Structurally, we will look at how many processes there are. So every neuron is going to have exactly one axon. So what we're going to look at is how many dendrites are there. And more than 99% of neurons are the neurons that look like the pictures I've been showing you. Why do we show you those pictures? Because that's more than 99% of them. And this is a neuron that has more than 2 dendrites. So it has 3 or more processes. Okay. So this multipolar neuron has 3 or more processes. So it has 1 axon and at least 2 dendrites. And all of our interneurons are going to be multipolar. Does that mean only interneurons are multipolar? No, but it means all of our interneurons are multipolar. Yes, we will have some other types of neurons, which we will see, some other functional type of neuron that is multipolar. The second type structurally is what is called a pseudo-unipolar, and previously was called unipolar. So I do have both names written there. Most people call it pseudo-unipolar. It used to be called unipolar because you had the cell body and then it looked like you had one process leaving it, which then split into two different directions. Now we know that one process is actually is not two processes. These two things are, this one is coming in and this one is going out. So that one process was actually two different processes adjacent to each other going in opposite directions. So it was where the axon, the outgoing axon, and the one incoming dendrite were fused. So that's why it's called pseudo-unipolar. And all of our sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system are going to be pseudo-unipolar. So remember, peripheral nervous system. So, and sensory means the cell body is not in the central nervous system, but those axon terminals, terminal boutons will be in the central nervous system. So where does that put the cell body? What do we call that area that contains cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system? If you don't remember, pause it now and go back and look it up because we covered it today. The third and final structural classification is called a bipolar neuron because it has two processes. These are the rare ones. Okay? The two processes are one axon for outgoing and one axon for, one dendrite for incoming. And the cell body is found in the middle, kind of like this. Well, I guess I should put it like this, because incoming and outgoing. So these are only found in some of the sense organs. So we come back later and we talk about the senses, especially special senses. I will be pointing out, look, bipolar neuron, here's another bipolar neuron. And so until we hear about that, just know what they are, but nothing we are discussing is going to be a bipolar neuron until we get to special senses. And with that, we are done with this introduction to the neuron. I want to thank you again for all your hard work, and I will see you soon. Have a great day.